Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about our new military's illegal abortion policy. You know, last November, I got word from the Pentagon that they were planning on replacing a 40-year law that was passed in this building about abortion in our military that has worked perfectly for 40 years, no complaints. But our president, in his wisdom, decided to change that abortion policy with a memo. So, because of that, I warned the Pentagon, don't do this. I mean, send this new policy through the Senate and let's vote on it. Let's represent our colleagues. Let's represent the people back home that send us up here. They elect us to do that, to make decisions for them, to represent them. I said in writing that if they impose this new policy, that I would put a hold on senior nominations in the military. That's the only power that we have in the minority to get the attention of the majority here in the Senate. Hated to do it. These people needed promotion. But somebody needs to wake up in the White House and the Pentagon that they cannot dictate policy here in the U.S. Senate. Send it over. Let's vote on it. So I put a hold 11 months ago on the admirals and generals and civil nominees. A few months went by, a few months being 11. And we've had that hold ever since they put this policy in place. But somebody had to stand up to what was going on. So I did it. I stood up knowing that I'm 100% military. My dad was in the military. I was a military brat. I believe in our military. It's the number one institution in this country because if we don't have peace and security for the American citizens, we are in trouble. Secretary Austin knew that I would hold these nominations. He knew it, but he decided to go ahead and do it anyway. It was his choice. The current leadership at the Pentagon seems to think that taxpayer-funded abortion is more important than military nominations. Now, let's get this straight. This was a policy we had for 40 years that was about rape, incest, and harm to the mom. It had worked for 40 years, but they decided to change that because they thought they could without the consent of the Senate. Since then, there's been absolutely no negotiation from my Democratic colleagues or the Biden administration. I've had a brief phone call a couple of times with the Secretary of Defense. No negotiations at all. You would think if they were really concerned about our military in a trying time in which we have all over the world, which they have created, that they would have called me, let's talk about this, let's work it out, we need promotions. Zero communications. I've been willing to negotiate the entire time. So instead, the Democrats have spent 11 months attacking me for trying to get them to do the right thing and to stand up for our military. No, they didn't want any of that. They wanted their way or the highway. Unfortunately, last month, even some of my Republican colleagues attacked me and attacked me personally here on this floor. I can see how this thing was going. They call themselves, military. People that support the military. There's nobody, again, that supports the military any more than me. But they are currently in the military, and they were standing up for their colleagues, which is fine. But I can stand, and we all can stand for life of the unborn and for our military. You can do both. Unfortunately, the Democrats don't want to do that. They do not like the unborn, and they don't care anything about the military, or they'd have done something about this. Everybody says, well, these guys need, and men and women need promotion. Well, these young unborn will never have a chance for a promotion because they don't want to kill them before they're born, which is absolutely amazing to me. I've been asking the Pentagon to support evidence of changing this policy, now again for almost a year. They said it's because of recruiting We need to be able to recruit more people, more women, because we need a better abortion policy. Again, there was zero evidence that this was going to help recruiting. And folks, our recruiting in the military has been an absolute, total disaster. Worst in the history in this country. We don't have anybody, hardly anybody, that wants to join a volunteer military. It's only gotten worse since this policy went into effect, which they started in February. I've asked the Pentagon how many people have used this policy since it's gone into place. They refuse to answer. They've given me no information at all. I've also explained on this floor many times that this policy is illegal. Now, if it was sent over here and we voted on it and passed, it is what it is. But that didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen because it didn't have the votes. It didn't have the votes to pass it. So, we have an immoral, illegal policy that has no basis of facts. The world is a much dangerous place today because of some of the things that's happened, such as this abortion policy being put in by Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer himself. It's become much more dangerous even since we put this policy in place last year. Over the last 3 years, we've seen some of the worst humiliations in the history of our military. President Biden waved the white flag of surrender in Afghanistan. We're leaving. We want out. That's without even helping people that are Americans and that have helped Americans for 20 years. We abandoned them. Just 2 months later, Vladimir Putin began massing forces on his border with Ukraine. I went to Ukraine right before the war started in Ukraine. Talked to President Zelensky himself. We need help. We need people at the border. If you'll send materials, they won't come in. This administration wouldn't listen. Just got out of the way, let them come in. Since then, by the way, we've spent $100 billion of the taxpayer dollars. Now we want to spend $100 billion more. Joe Biden failed to deter President Putin. Joe Biden failed to deter Hamas because of his support of Iran, his appeasement of Iran for the last 3 years of giving them money. Iran is flush with cash now. Hamas is one of their proxies. Joe Biden has been softer on Iran than any president in American history. There is no question that America is less safe today than it was before Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer took control of Washington, D.C. There's no question. The facts speak for itself. We have weakened our military. And the Democrats in Congress have been more than happy to go along with all these policies. There are no complaints from our Democratic colleagues. I'll just mention a few examples. Joe Biden drove out 8,000. Just think about this. We drove out 8,000 people in the military because they would not take a vaccine. 8,000 people that love this country. Democrats in the Senate refused to reinstate them and give them back pay when we voted on it about a year ago. Now the Pentagon and my colleagues are begging them to please come back. We can't get anybody to take a job in the military. Please come back. It's no surprise most of these heroes that we ran out because of a vaccine will not come back. You know, I heard that Senator Durbin now wants illegal immigrants to serve in the military because we can't find enough Americans. And did I just not hear on the floor that Senator Durbin and Senator Schumer are against assault weapons? I heard that. Everybody's got their opinion. But they want to turn around and give an assault weapon to a Chinese or a Russian or Iranian that's come in this country illegally to protect the American citizens of the United States of America. Have we lost our mind? We have absolutely lost it when it comes to protecting the citizens of this country. Is anybody in the White House asking why we can't recruit anymore? Absolutely amazing to me. Here's another example. Our Navy is not building enough ships that are required by law that we've passed. We're not building them. We're worried more about climate change, EV cars. Folks, we had better start protecting our borders and our country, or we're not going to have a country. I've never seen anything like it. The Pentagon has become more distracted from its core mission by things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Pentagon just asked for $114 million. Now, I've been told during this last 11 months what I've been attacked by the Democrats. Been attacked every day by the Democrats. Oh, this is not a woke military. Wait a minute. We're not teaching social justice programs in the military, but we want $114 million more to give for diversity, equity, inclusion. We don't even know how much the abortion travel memo is costing. More and more veterans are telling their kids, don't join this woke military. I hear it every time I go out on the road and talk to groups, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. I mean, it's not about party. It's about an institution that has been sacred to all of us in this country for 247 years, but now it's under attack. It's under attack by politicians. So, this list goes on and on about the problems in the military. It's an absolute disaster. And then last week, Senator Schumer stooped to a new low. The House and the Senate every year puts a budget independently, then we bring it together, and then we vote on the discrepancies. And to build one bill together with the House, voted on by people on each side. I was involved in that, but it was a sham. The conference is supposed to report it out as a single bill after we put it together, but we had no vote. We had no vote. The conference committee was just brought in for pictures. All the confirmations was done by the leadership. Senator Schumer got the #1 vote. The abortion policy was in the House side. It got kicked out. We were supposed to vote on it. I had the votes to get it done, but he knew that, and so now we have an illegal abortion policy. This bill was written in the back rooms, which is a lot of things done here, not by many, but by few. I came here to represent the people of Alabama. If you're not given a vote, why even send people up here? I didn't come here to outsource my job to the Pentagon or the White House, or frankly, to the leadership, either side, making a difference, Democrat or Republican. This issue of taxpayer-funded abortion could have been resolved through the NDAA, and whatever the outcome, I'm fine. But bring it to the floor, and let's vote on it. That's our job. But that doesn't happen. It's not happening because Senator Schumer knew that he couldn't get it passed. But that's how D.C. works. Abortion is so important to Senator Schumer that he's not letting us vote on this. Therefore, there no longer appears to be any short-term path to end this Pentagon's illegal abortion policy. Some other policies will take time for me to work through the process, but that doesn't happen overnight. So yesterday I announced that I would change my tactics and let the promotions go through. Promotions that they needed, our military needed. But again, Senator Schumer and his colleagues could care less. They held their feet to the fire. No negotiations. But I'm going to continue to hold the 4-star generals. People say, why would you just hold 4 stars? We got 11 of them. Today we have 44 4-stars in the military. World War II we had 7. 44 to 7. We had 12 million with 7 4-stars. Today we have 44 4-stars with 2 million. Doesn't make sense. Too many chiefs. So we're going to hold those 4 stars, but we can bring them one at a time. They need to be vetted. We need to know who's running our military. These jobs are too important to rubber stamp. And we need to keep fighting to make our military stronger and stronger. The fight for integrity of our military leadership will continue as long as I'm here. The fight to keep politics out of the most sacred institution will continue. The fight to protect Senate and the executive branch overreach will continue. Senator Schumer, he can rig it all he wants, but this fight is not over. We'll continue to take it to the American people because elections have consequences. And don't think next year's is not very, very important. I'm not going to stop fighting for these things, and I'm not going to stop fighting for the American people. That's the reason we're here. A lot of people forget that. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I've stood here as I've listened to Senator Tuberville say that the world is a more dangerous place. He's spoken about how we have weakened our military. Senator Tuberville is right on that. And one of the principal reasons is because of Senator Tuberville's own actions. He has held up hundreds of military nominations, hundreds of our military leaders who have not made it to the posts they were assigned to. It is clear that it was a grave mistake for one senator to hold our military promotion system hostage over his personal disagreement with the Department of Defense policy. We need our commanders in the Pacific to deter China and our service vice chiefs to lead the military. I am relieved that he has released most of his holds, but he continues to weaken our military readiness and undermine both recruiting and retention. The Senate should not go home for the holidays until we confirm the remaining nominees. This senator has held up nominations for nearly a year. It undermines our national defense, and it is unfair to our military and to our military families. He insults our military, and then he turns around and tries to blame President Biden for his own actions. The hypocrisy of this senator is truly breathtaking. We've got to stay, and we've got to get these military leaders confirmed. Right now, Mr. President, we are seeing one of the deadliest years of gun violence in recent history. There have been more than 600 mass shootings since the beginning of this year alone. That is nearly 2 mass shootings a day. And assault weapons have become the firearm of choice in more and more mass shootings over the decades. Assault weapons kill with deadly efficiency. When an assault weapon is used in a shooting, more than double the number of people on average are shot, and more than 50% are killed. Let me be clear. These military-style assault weapons are weapons of war, and they have no place in our communities. Our kids are growing up seeing military rifles in civilian hands on the streets and in their classrooms. Since 2011, the rate of children dying from firearms has skyrocketed by nearly 90%. Enough is enough. It has never been more obvious that Congress needs to ban assault weapons. This isn't some far-fetched idea. We have tried it. Senator Dianne Feinstein championed an assault weapons ban, and she got it passed into law. It was in place for a full decade, from 1994 to 2004, and it worked. Researchers from Quinnipiac University, from NYU's School of Medicine, and more have found that while the ban was in place, there was a meaningful reduction in the number of mass shootings. But the law sunsetted in 2004, and in the following 2 decades, there have been more and more and more mass shootings. Today, we must act to reinstate a national ban on assault weapons. It is hard to overstate the urgency of this issue. From Sandy Hook to Parkland and from Orlando to Uvalde, these horrific mass shootings all involved an assault weapon. This fall's shooting in Lewiston, Maine also involved a powerful assault rifle and was the deadliest shooting of this year. After each of these tragedies, Americans ask, what will it take for Congress to act? How many more communities and how many more families will lose loved ones before the laws are changed? We mourn the individuals lost to gun violence. We mourn the families left behind when a beloved son or daughter or mom or dad is cut down by gun violence. And we mourn the communities torn apart by gun violence. But they don't need our thoughts and prayers nearly as much as they need Congress to do its job and take action. We have shown we can act in moments of crisis. Last year, after 21 children and teachers were killed in Uvalde, we passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That was the most sweeping gun violence prevention legislation in nearly 30 years, but it didn't go far enough. This is another moment of crisis. Today, we have another chance with this vote to make it easier for Americans to move through their daily lives without fear of being gunned down by weapons of war. I urge Congress to reinstate the assault weapons ban that Senator Feinstein secured 30 years ago and that would help save lives today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I also am here to talk about gun violence. But before I get to that, I wanted to address some of the comments we heard from Senator Tuberville. I think the people of this country and the people who are visiting our chamber today need to understand that for 10 months, Senator Tuberville has been playing politics. He has literally held the entire military chain of command hostage. He was offered a vote on his policy. He turned it down. He was the subject of a rules exception passed through my committee on a 9-7 vote that would have put all of the nominations together. And even then, he kept standing his ground. Finally, when he realized that a number of his Republican colleagues who came to the floor repeatedly were going to vote for that change, he finally relented. But it was the words of the military families and the veterans' families that made the biggest difference. The spouses who had put their own jobs on hold, left their jobs teaching school because they thought they were going to move. The people who didn't even know where to put their parents in an assisted living because they didn't know. These are military families that are serving our country. And national security, he held up numerous key personnel at a time when there are conflicts all over the world. And still, it is important to note, which he admitted on the floor today, he is holding up 11 four-star officers, including the head of Cybercom, at a time when Vladimir Putin and other tyrants see that cyber as a weapon of war. He is holding up the commander of the Pacific Air Command. So he continues his hold. And yes, we will not go home for Christmas until we finish our work and get these 11 additional officers held. And let me just end this moment by quoting him from the hallways yesterday from a reporter. He was asked about this, and he said, "I'd have loved to have 5 downs in football instead of 4. But you can't do it. It's got to be fair for everybody." Asked if he has regrets. It was pretty much a draw. I mean, they didn't get what they wanted. Really? Who is the they? I guess the they is the military members, the service members who serve our country. And my last message on this front is that this is not a game, Senator Tuberville. This is not a game. This is not a football game. These are real people's lives and the security of our country. And I'm pleased that we've gotten through these 425 nominees, but there are clearly more to go. On the subject of gun violence, it seems we know as Americans that every week there's another tragedy, whether it's in Maine, whether it's a bowling alley, whether it's a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, or a school in Nashville. Earlier this year, by chance, I was in Nashville only a week after that school shooting in a bookstore. And a mother came up to me in the middle of the aisle. She was sobbing, and she explained that her daughter was the best friend of one of the kids that was killed. And she took her phone out and showed me in real time that morning the text chains of the moms who were planning a jazz fundraiser at the school for the school when the news came out. And you could see the texts of these 20 or so moms saying, well, that must not be true. It's just something on social media. Well, no, I hear the sirens right now. Well, no, I hear it's true. I see the police cars going by. One of the moms, I'm going over there right now. The text chain goes on and on and on. And then you start seeing the text. Haley is okay. Hallelujah, she's fine. The names of the kids as they found out hours later if they were okay. And then the last text is, we lost Evie. That for me was the real moment that so many parents across this country experience when their kids are just going to school. This week we passed a grim milestone. We have now had more gun-related mass killings this year than any year since 2006. Nearly 40,000 Americans have lost their lives to gun violence this year alone. So we call on our colleagues today to say enough is enough. We know what the solutions are. We know it's not just one solution for each kind of gun violence incident. I come from a state with a time-honored tradition of hunting and fishing. And so when I look at these gun proposals, I always ask myself, would this proposal hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? No, he doesn't need an AK-47 to go deer hunting. That's why nearly 2/3 of Americans, including many Republicans, support reinstating an assault weapons ban. That's why over 80% of Americans support expanding background checks and closing dangerous loopholes, as we did with Senator Murphy and many other senators' leadership, my provision to keep guns away from domestic abusers. We must pass the Background Check Expansion Act, led by Senator Murphy, which would close the dangerous gun show loophole, which allows unlicensed gun dealers, such as those at gun shows, to sell a firearm without conducting a background check. These are common sense bills. Americans are with us, and we simply cannot sit back and do nothing while gun violence shatters families and neighborhoods across the country. We had a moment last year, and we passed a bipartisan bill, and we thank our Republican colleagues who joined us on this bill. But now we know there is more to do. Just ask that mom in Nashville. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today because we are living in a nation besieged by gun violence. So far this year, our nation has experienced this year 630 mass shootings. Now, this is day number 340 in the year 2023. So 340 days, 630 mass shootings. That's nearly as many, twice as many mass shootings as we've seen days. Our precious children are afraid to go to school. They're worried that their classroom may be the next Robb Elementary, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, or Sandy Hook, as we remember that somber anniversary. I heard one of my colleagues, the senator from Wyoming, earlier today say that they're trying to take our freedoms away. We've heard that a lot from folks on the other side. They're trying to take our freedoms away. It's a strange freedom that regularly sends our children into lockdown. What kind of freedom is that? According to the Gun Violence Archive, we've lost over 1,500 children to gun violence this year. And I think that there is a kind of unspoken assumption, as we've been pushing for common sense gun safety and have gotten very little movement in Congress. I think the unspoken assumption is that this will not visit me. It will not happen to my family. When you consider that there have been 630 mass shootings already this year, sadly, the chances are quite good that this could visit any one of us. And we ought to do our work here in the Congress as if we are protecting our own families, because when we look out for other people's families, when we look out for other people's children, we look out for our own, and it could visit any one of us. We act as if this is normal. Business as usual. What legislative action has the Senate passed to address this epidemic of gun violence? The Senate actually voted to give less information to the National Criminal Background Check System. Now, keep in mind that according to a 2023 Fox News poll, 87% of Americans believe that we ought to have universal background checks. Listen, let me say that again. According to a Fox News poll, 87% of Americans believe that we ought to have universal background checks. And so they present this as if it is an argument between Democrats and Republicans. Really, it is an argument between Washington and craven politicians and ordinary people every day who are just trying to live their lives in safety. There is a broadening gap between what Americans want and what they can get from their government. So at root, this is a democracy problem. The question is, who owns our democracy and at what cost to our children and to our families? And so we have a moral obligation not to turn away. Across the country, outside of Washington, there is widespread agreement that Congress needs to enact common sense gun safety solutions. 87% of Americans believe that we ought to have universal background checks. Every day I hear from Georgians who are sick and tired of losing people they love to gun violence. As a pastor, I presided over the funerals. And it begs me to ask, how is it that we can't keep our own people alive? What kind of nation tells its children that the only thing we can do in the wake of this crisis is to teach you how to hide? Last year, for the first time in 30 years, we were able to pass modest but meaningful gun safety legislation, but it was not nearly enough, and it took 30 years just to do that. And so we're all set to go home later this month to spend a few weeks safely, I hope, with our loved ones. And I encourage all of my colleagues to reflect on this question: are we going to let other people's loved ones continue to die by the tens of thousands and let our babies get killed in their classroom for another 30 years before we choose to act? The time is always right to do what is right, Dr. King taught us, and that time is now. Mr. Chair, I yield the floor.
President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Senator Warnock and others for coming to the floor today to raise this truly existential crisis, put it in front of our colleagues. I have lost count of the number of times I've come down to the floor of the Senate to talk about this immoral anomaly in which you are subject to the risk of death by gunshot wound in the United States at a rate 10 times higher than any other high-income nation. I wish there was a truly complicated set of factors that play into the reason why we have so much more gun violence here than in other nations, but it probably isn't that complicated. We don't have more mental illness in this country. We don't spend less money on law enforcement. We don't have angrier people. We just have a lot more guns, and we are much more permissive in this country about allowing felons, dangerous people, the mentally ill to get their hands on guns, and we are much more permissive around the question of which kind of guns get in the hands of private citizens, especially guns that are designed to kill as many human beings as quickly as possible. As you can imagine, because I have a pretty high profile on this issue, when I'm back in my state, I get confronted a lot by supporters of the Second Amendment, NRA members, who want to have a conversation with me about why I believe what I believe. And that conversation normally starts with the assumption that I want to take guns away or ammunition away from law-abiding gun owners. And almost without exception, when I get confronted by somebody who wants to talk about guns with me, who comes from that gun rights side of the debate, as quickly as I can get the debate to background checks is when we start agreeing. Because I have found very few of those conversations in Connecticut where even in the most heated of arguments, we don't find quick agreement on the simple idea that before you buy a gun, you should have to prove that you're not a criminal or you're not seriously mentally ill. Why? Because law-abiding gun owners have gone through background checks. They know that in 90% of the cases, those background checks are processed instantaneously while you are in the store. And for most of the people who are talking to me who aren't mentally ill and who don't have criminal histories, that's their only experience, is that the background check is not a barrier to purchasing a gun. And so it's just not surprising to me to hear the data that Senator Warnock is talking about. 90% of Americans supporting universal background checks, checks on every gun sale. 89% of Republicans, 89% of gun owners, 70% of NRA members. Because even to gun owners, even to people who feel so fired up about this issue that they want to come talk to me in the middle of a county fair, we're not disagreeing about that simple policy. Just make sure that people who shouldn't have guns don't get their hands on them. Now, some people will say, well, it's a hassle. It's an unreasonable barrier. Well, I just told you that in 90% of the cases, they're resolved instantaneously. In the 10% of cases where it takes more than 5 minutes, that's normally because there's something on that person's record that we need to find out. And what we know is that there have been millions of gun purchases that have been denied because felons or seriously mentally ill individuals did try to buy those guns. But we also know that 99% of Americans live within 10 miles of a gun store. There are 60,000 licensed gun dealers across this country who can perform background checks. That's 4 times the number of McDonald's restaurants in America. It's just not true that this is an unreasonable restriction of your liberty to just make sure you get a background check before you buy a gun. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about guns that are largely sold online and through gun shows. Because the law today, the federal law, that I think we still all agree on, I don't hear a lot of my Republican colleagues proposing legislation to repeal the requirement that you should get a background check if you go into a gun store. All we're talking about is extending that requirement to the place where a lot of guns are now sold in a way they weren't when we passed the National Instant Criminal Background Check law in the early 90s. Today, a lot more guns are sold at gun stores, a lot more guns are sold online. And the studies that have been done about gun sales online are really troubling. One study showed that there were 1.2 million online ads offering firearms for sale that would not require a background check to be done. That same study showed that 1 in 9 prospective buyers of guns online would not pass a background check. That is a rate 7 times higher than the denial rate at gun stores. And the reason is the criminals are going online and going to the gun store and going to the gun shows because they know they will fail the background check if they go to a bricks and mortar store. That's what Seth Ator did. He failed a background check when he tried to purchase a gun in 2014, but he went to a private seller online, he bought a gun, and then he used it to kill 7 people and wound 25 others in a mass shooting in Odessa. This is not theoretical. This happens. How do you think all these guns get into our cities? It's because the criminal traffickers who have serious criminal records, who can't buy guns at a bricks and mortar store, go to a state that doesn't have universal checks. The criminals, the traffickers, buy the guns online or at a gun show, and then they drive them up to Hartford, Connecticut, and they sell them on the black market. The data just tells us that people believe in background checks, they want us to pass universal background checks, and the data also tells us that it works. Now, the numbers vary, but even the least generous studies tell us that in states that have universal background checks, like Connecticut, 10% less people are dying from gun homicides. And of course, my law can't fully protect the people in my state because those guns get trafficked into Connecticut from states that don't have universal background checks. And so the numbers would be even bigger if we didn't have all of these loopholes. And so I agree with Senator Warnock. This just feels like a test of democracy. It really does. Like, how does democracy survive if 90% of Americans, 90% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats want something and we can't deliver it? You want to know why people are flirting with autocracy and dictatorship? It's because even when they agree at a 90% rate, they can't get what they want from their government. I got to tell you, something does seem pretty wrong if democracy can't deliver on a 90% consensus. And not a 90% consensus about whether your road gets paved. A 90% consensus on whether kids live or die. A 90% consensus on an existential question of survival. And so, Mr. President, as in legislative session, I'm going to ask, Mr. President, that we pass a bill that will require universal background checks in this country. I'm going to ask my colleagues to respect the wishes of 90% of Americans and do something that we know works. And so I'm going to ask, as in legislative session, for unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 494 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I want to note at the outset, we're not asked to vote in this chamber on polling questions. We vote on legislation. And while people, when responding to a poll, may respond overwhelmingly in response to certain questions, it doesn't mean that when they come to understand fully what the law at issue would actually do, that they wouldn't feel differently. The truth is that the legislation that we're being asked to pass by unanimous consent today, without additional debate, discussion, opportunity for amendment, opportunity for input by the public, that is the bill that is S. 494, the Background Check Expansion Act, has some real problems with it, problems that I think make it a bill that stands to transform, in some circumstances, ordinary, law-abiding citizens into criminals. We always have to consider this when evaluating any law, particularly any law with criminal implications, that touches on a constitutionally protected right enumerated in a constitutional amendment. This is not solely about transactions involving guns at gun stores. This is about the father who wishes to pass down a hunting rifle to his son, or the friend who wants to lend a shotgun to his neighbor who is in need of protection at the time. Universal background checks, as this bill conceives them, don't just regulate, they criminalize these quintessential moments of American life. And under this legislation would render unlawful what in countless circumstances would be lawful and even constitutionally protected behavior. Now, most would not think twice about lending a firearm to a family member for sporting or personal protection purposes. And yet this bill threatens to do that by narrowing the definition of family to such an extent that passing a gun to a daughter-in-law or to a great-grandson could lead to criminal charges. This bill fails to distinguish between a criminal act and a gesture of trust and safety. Participating in a hunting trip often involves using firearms, of course. It's important to be aware that under this proposal, under this bill, if you hand over your firearm to a partner during such a trip, even for a short period of time, you could potentially be held criminally liable if that individual doesn't hold the proper hunting license. And it's an absurd overreach that would penalize the innocent traditions that bind our communities together. The only conceivable way to enforce such a law is through the creation of an expansive Orwellian National Gun Registry. Yes, a National Gun Registry. Now, it's here that we arrive at the true purpose, or at least the true inevitable outcome of this legislation were it to become law. Universal background checks only work when you have a National Gun Registry. This bill would require a registry, even though, and notwithstanding the legitimate policy concerns embraced by Congress when Congress prohibited the creation of such a registry in the Firearms Owners Protection Act. However, the ATF has already compiled a database with over 920 million records, a direct challenge to both the letter and spirit of the Firearm Owners Protection Act and Public Law 11255. Let's not compound the problem created by the ATF's illegal and constitutionally problematic registry by enacting a law that cannot be enforced without the creation of a National Gun Registry. And registries lead inevitably to gun confiscation. If you don't believe me, you don't want to take my word for it on that, just look to the public statements made by some of my colleagues in the Senate and our counterparts in the House. They told us confiscation is the goal. As our friends at Gun Owners of America have reminded us, without this invasive registry, enforcement of S-494 is unfeasible. We're staring down the barrel of a system that would monitor the most personal and responsible uses of firearms among citizens. Now, the senator asks us to pass this major legislation without any debate, without any meaningful opportunity for amendment, further discussion. This isn't how Congress works. This certainly isn't how the United States Senate should work, certainly not on a matter so significant and so directly tied to an enumerated constitutional right as this one. This bill should, of course, go through the Senate Judiciary Committee, a body on which I serve, and a body where members routinely can and do debate, offer amendments, and raise these and other policy and constitutional concerns. I also want to speak to a moment to what was referenced as the gun show loophole. It is not, in fact, a loophole. There is no such loophole. The effect of the law is that if you are a federally licensed firearms dealer, you have to perform these functions before you sell it, with or without you being in the presence of a gun show. If an FFL shows up to a gun show and sells guns, the FFL has to conduct the background check. It isn't a loophole. Moreover, we're talking about a tiny, minuscule percentage of people who even do these things. We're looking at the overwhelming percentage. According to the Department of Justice Bureau that collects crime statistics, a tiny percentage of people who even buy them at gun shows go on to commit crimes with them, like less than 1%. Very few of them even buy them in any retail establishment, opting instead to buy them on a clandestine market in an illegal way. So at the end of the day, we have to evaluate this law just like we would with any law, but this law in particular, given that it touches on a constitutionally protected enumerated right We have to look both at the law's impact on criminal behavior, which is negligible, and on the law's tendency to punish the law-abiding. It is not the law-abiding who typically will go to illegal sources to buy a gun. It is not the law-abiding who dot the I's and cross the T's and make sure they do, who refuse to dot the I's and cross the T's. It's typically the law-abiding who are willing to go through that process. We shouldn't be adding more red tape that's going to affect mostly the law-abiding, touching on very few of those actually bent on violent criminal activity. This bill would do precisely that. It would punish the law-abiding citizens for the actions of criminals. It's time to accept this fact, and it's time for us really to choose between the various tensions that we feel pulling on us. I'm confident that at the end of the day, we should choose common sense over fear. We should choose liberty over control. And we should choose the rights of the law-abiding many over the criminally minded few. On this basis, Mr. President, for these reasons, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
You know, as I listened to the objection of my colleague from Utah, I am really struck by the absurdity and the exaggeration involved in opposition to these common sense measures that would simply save lives. The idea that we haven't debated background checks. What could be more untethered to reality? We have debated background checks for as long as I've been in the United States Senate, and before then, when I was Attorney General, seeking to champion universal background checks. We have debated them in the Judiciary Committee ad nauseum. And we have shown through the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that we can break the hold of the gun lobby that is the source of those absurd and ridiculous arguments. Background checks take no guns away from any law-abiding citizen. They simply assure that people who are dangerous to themselves or others don't have them. That is the purpose of red flag laws, which I have also championed, and many of the other measures that we seek to pass. The repeal of PLACA, which guarantees unbridled immunity to gun manufacturers, ghost guns, which we seek to ban because law enforcement finds them so dangerous, and numerous other common sense measures. I'm here on behalf of a bill, Ethan's Law, Senate 173, which ought to be common ground for everyone. It simply requires safe storage. And we know that 500 Americans every year, including more than 100 children, die from unintentional firearm injuries, many of them involving weapons that are unsafely stored. There are loaded and unlocked guns in the homes of 4.6 million American children, and many of them perish because their parents or their neighbors' parents fail to safe store those weapons. Nobody knows it better than Kristen Song. Her son died as a result of an unsafely stored weapon just after his 15th birthday. He was with a friend, and a firearm stored in a Tupperware box was used in play by these two young boys. Ethan Song died. And Ethan's Law which I am seeking to pass by unanimous consent today, is in his memory. It was passed by the State House of Representatives in Connecticut and our state Senate. And 26 states, red, blue, purple, already have some form of safe storage and child access prevention laws on the books. We know from the record of these laws in Connecticut that they work, they save lives. And we know also that gun owners believe that safe storage ought to be the law, ought to be required, ought to be mandated so that lives are safe. In fact, even the firearms industry, including the National Rifle Association and the National Shooting Sports Foundation, agree that safe storage is a critical part of responsible gun ownership. The NRA tells gun owners that, quote, strong boxes and security cases are impressive and give quick access to firearms in a defensive situation. The NSSF tells gun owners to, quote, always make absolutely sure that firearms in your home are securely stored, out of the reach of children and unauthorized persons. 90% of the guns used in unintentional shootings, deaths by children, were left unlocked and loaded. The numbers are outrageous and depressing. But we can do something, and we should do something, and that is why I am here today to urge that we pass a bill that ought to be common ground, bipartisan common ground, and show that, in fact, democracy can work. We can pass measures that save lives that should be bipartisan. There ought to be no Republican versus Democratic debate on this floor or anywhere else. It ought to be a matter of common sense and common agreement across the aisle. And so, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-173 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that this bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid on the table. No single gun owner will lose a gun, none, as a result of this measure. Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from North Carolina.
reserving the right to object. I oppose Senate 173 for a simple reason. It's unconstitutional in a number of ways. First, the bill infringes on the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens by placing burdens on citizens' right to keep and bear arms within a home. Second, this bill thrusts the federal government into an area that is reserved to the states, thus violating the principle of federalism. The laws in Connecticut and the laws in North Carolina should reflect the values and behaviors of those respective states. Simply put, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't fit the needs of our constituents. Thirdly, Congress does not have the power under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to pass the bill. A law-abiding gun owner with a firearm in their home doesn't qualify as interstate commerce, and the federal government has no right to infringe upon it. Fourth, this bill duplicates existing laws and practices that are in place at the state level. My colleague mentioned some of those. He mentioned state laws. For example, in North Carolina, we have criminal penalties for adults who improperly store a firearm in a way that allows a minor to obtain it and commit a crime. And finally, this bill would make it harder for law-abiding gun owners to defend themselves and their loved ones. At a time when our cities and our towns they're plagued by waves of crime, often made worse by soft-on-crime policies of Democrat politicians, it makes no sense for the federal government to make it illegal for homeowners to quickly defend themselves inside their own home. Just this year in North Carolina, in my own state alone, there have been at least 13 documented instances of defensive gun use in the home. Defensive gun use. In these instances, North Carolina residents have used guns to defend themselves against home invasions, assaults, domestic violence, and residential burglary. No matter what somebody believes about the Second Amendment, we share the desire to protect our kids and keep them safe. We all want our kids to be safe. And that's why gun rights groups across the country have safety courses and online materials and in-person training to teach citizens, both young and old, how to safely own, operate, and enjoy firearms. Now's not the time for more unconstitutional proposals that will not ultimately keep people safe. Therefore, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from New Jersey.
10 years I've been in this incredible institution in the United States Senate, and I am stunned that we are still having this debate. We know, if you read our Constitution, that we formed our form of government with lots of high callings, but the first is to provide for the national defense. It is astonishing to me that the number one killer, the number one threat, the number one issue facing our children in America is death by gun violence. This is a purview of the federal government, as is written by our Constitution. And the Second Amendment, like the First Amendment, is not absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. There are limitations on our fundamental rights. Don't take my word for it. Take the Supreme Court of the United States. A conservative court in the Heller decision made it very clear that government can take steps, reasonable steps, to protect our nation. And so what does it mean in a country when the top killer of our children is gun violence, and we cannot take common sense steps like the ones spelled out in the law that was just objected to? Safe storage of weapons. This is not an infringement of someone's right to own a gun. Safe storage of weapons. This is not taking away someone's gun. Safe storage of weapons. This is not a violation of someone's fundamental rights. What it is a reasonable step to protect children, because 90% of the kids in our country that are dying by suicide or unintentional shootings are in homes where a loaded gun is easily accessible from children. Children as young as 3 years old getting their hands on these weapons. Over 40,000 Americans die in a year to gun violence. And the response of this body is to do nothing. 40,000 Americans, the number one killer of our children, and instead of seeing this as a crisis, for us having special hearings and gatherings to put our minds together in a bipartisan way, how do we stop our children from dying? How do we stop our children from being slaughtered? Instead of this being something that is concerning us to do something, we do nothing. And I'm sorry, inaction is complicity in this violence. If you object to this, what's your idea to protect our children? If you object to this, what is your idea to stop so many kids, so many Americans from dying? Tell me what it is. Because Martin Luther King said it plain in another point in American history, in another crisis. He said what we will have to repent for as a nation is not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. And so I know this body. I know the good, hardworking, dedicated Americans who serve here. But the inaction is appalling. The inaction is complicity. The strongest nation on the planet Earth gives the implicit messages to our children and their parents: we can't protect you, so you know what we're going to do? We're going to teach you how to hide. Because we are now in a nation where there are more active shooter drills than there are fire drills. What message is this to our children and our families? That we are saying we're going to do nothing. Another year will pass. Another 40,000 Americans are going to die, and we do nothing to protect you. That is unacceptable to me. We are better than this. We are stronger than this. The very ideal of liberty should be that our people should not live in fear. But by our inaction, we have a nation where people all over our country are now chained to fear, shackled by grief, communities ripped apart, families in mourning. And a simple step in America, a simple federal law like seatbelt laws, a simple federal law like the safety of our airplanes, a simple federal law to address the number one cause of killing in our children, that if you have a loaded firearm at home, you should lock it up and keep it away from a child. We can't do that. Well, Merry Christmas, America. The most urgent and basic thing this body should do is to protect children. And the number one cause of child death in America, what have we done this year? Nothing. Nothing. This is a time we should act. This is a time we should join together. I call on my Republican colleagues to put forth one idea that will save a child from gun violence. To show that your allegiance is to safety and security. No other country deals with this. We are an aberration when it comes to deaths by gun violence. No other nation allows their children to be slaughtered. Canada, New Zealand, I can tell you the nations that have taken actions and as a result seen a dramatic drop in the numbers of deaths. We are an exceptional country, but in this case, being the exception is horrific to too many. And so I am disappointed to sit here and witness an objection. But I am relentless. We must be undeterred because change is not always easy. But in this case, we as a country, with thousands of our children dying every year, must stay determined to make the change necessary for us to protect the people of this great republic. Mr. President, I yield the floor.